Hello, my name is Sandra Irwin, and this lecture is about the use of poetic devices to create lyrical prose. Just for your information, I'm both a poet and a fiction writer, and although I have chosen to concentrate in fiction, I did my first term in poetry. I've also published a good number of poems and a poetry chapbook. If you have an interest in writing lyrical prose, you may well already have studied poetry. It will come as no surprise to you then that many of the devices that make a poem musical, effective, and memorable make prose so as well. We're going to take a look at those poetic devices that have been employed by diverse English language writers to render their work lyrical with an eye to learning how to use the devices and techniques in our own writing. Why did the ancients like Homer write their epics in verse? Because the rhythm and musical effects in verse rendered the epics memorable. The verses were intended to be spoken, and it was more pleasurable for the listener to hear and easier for the speaker to remember if there were strong rhythms and music in the verses. Let's start with rhythm. Where does rhythm come from? The answer is it comes from repetition. Repetition is the foundation of music, poetry, and lyrical prose. Repeated sounds, notes, words, chords, grammatical structures, and melodies are all very powerful in the three arts. Focusing on prose for a moment, let's take this example by Margaret Atwood. She did understand, or at least she understood that she was supposed to understand. She understood and said nothing about it, and prayed for the power to forgive, and did forgive. But he can't have found living with her forgiveness all that easy. Breakfast in a haze of forgiveness, coffee with forgiveness, porridge with forgiveness, forgiveness on the buttered toast. The repetition of the words understand, understood, forgive, forgiveness, and the phrases with forgiveness command attention and drive home Atwood's message. The particular kind of repetition at work here is called repetend. It is defined as the irregular repetition of a word or phrase at various places throughout a poem or piece of prose. Anaphora is the repetition of a word or group of words at the beginning of lines, clauses, or sentences. Allen Ginsberg employed the device in many poems, including his famous Howl. Since our primary focus is on lyrical prose rather than poetry, let's listen to the anaphora in one of Winston Churchill's World War II speeches. We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. The anaphora engages our attention and helps us to focus on the words that follow the repeated words. Churchill used it to elevate his speech so that it would boost his people's morale and encourage them forward to achieve a difficult victory. The opposite of anaphora is epistrophe, which is the repetition of the same word or group of words at the end of successive clauses or sentences. This is how it was put to work by Robert Penn Warren. The big sycamore by the creek was gone. The willow tangle was gone. The little enclave of untrodden bluegrass was gone. The clump of dogwood on the rise across the creek, now that, too, was gone. The epistrophe is in the repetition of was gone, and the repetition compels the reader to focus more clearly on exactly what things were, in fact, gone, and emphasizes the sadness that the fact they were gone brought about. Let's focus a little more now on how musicality can be achieved in words. Musicality, as we have said, comes from the repetition of sounds. Vladimir Nabokov was a great lyricist, as is evident in the first sentence of Lolita. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins. The repetition of the long O and the long I vowel sounds creates marvelous and memorable music. This device is called assonance, the patterning of vowel sounds without regard to consonants. This patterning may be successive, as in Eliot's "Knee deep in the salt marsh," where one long E sound follows another, and then the short ah sound is also repeated. The patterning of sounds in assonance may also be alternating, as in Hausmann's "left my necktie," where the short E sound is followed by a long I sound, and then that pattern is repeated. Finally, assonance may be chiastic, where the order of the two vowel sounds reverses in the middle of the pattern, so that the first sound matches the last sound, and the second sound or sounds is repeated in between them, as in the Nabokov line we just read, "Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins." Here the two long O sounds bookend the three long I sounds. Note that the assonance differs from full rhyme in that rhyme usually takes both vowel and consonant sounds, as in lake and fake, while assonance is demonstrated in the words lake and fate, where the vowel sounds are the same but the consonant sounds differ. Consonance is the poetic companion to assonance. Assonance repeats vowel sounds, but consonance repeats consonants. Some definitions of consonants are quite narrow and limited to the repetition of sounds in the final consonants of stressed syllables, with the vowels that precede them differing, as add and read, or mill and ball. Furthermore, some writers don't call the relationship between add and read consonants, but address it as slant rhyme, half rhyme, or off rhyme. By contrast, other sources define consonants much more broadly. To quote from one, "Consonance is a pleasing sound caused by the repetition of consonant sounds within sentences, phrases, or in poems. Typically, this repetition occurs at the end of words, but also may be found within a word or at the beginning." Let's look at some examples. These lines are from Emily Dickinson's poem, "As Imperceptibly as Grief." "A quietness distilled as nature long begun, or nature spending with herself sequestered afternoon." The use of the N sounds in the words begun and afternoon exemplifies the narrow definition of consonants, or as many poets call it, slant rhyme. But now look at this sentence from Tim O'Brien. "He used his entrenching tool like an axe, slashing, feeling both love and hate, and then later, when it was full dark, he sat at the bottom of his foxhole and wept." I believe that the use of axe and fox and hate and wept comes closest to the matching of the strict definition of consonants. However, I would argue that there is more consonants in the sentence, because the fact is that the ear can hear all the L sounds in tool, slashing, feeling, love, later, full, and whole. It can also hear the T sounds in tool, hate, later, it, sat, at, bottom, and wept. Alliteration is similar to consonants, or in fact, a narrow version of consonants, in that it involves the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words appearing close to one another in the text. Again, the opening lines of Lolita give us a lovely example. "Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lolita." The tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. First, there is the series of initial L's, then the S's, then more L's, along with a spectacular number of T's. Whether we insist that the definition of consonants be limited to slant rhyme and that alliteration be considered its own device, thus ignoring the repetition of consonants within the middle of words, I would argue that the fact is the repetition of consonants anywhere in words is heard in the reader's ear and creates a musical effect. In my opinion, then, any form of consonance constitutes a poetic device and can contribute to the making of lyrical prose. Now let's step away from musicality for a few minutes and consider some poetic devices which do not rely on the repetition of sounds to achieve their effects. I'm speaking of figurative language and imagery. Figures of speech are a way of saying something other than the ordinary way, or, more narrowly defined, ways of saying one thing and meaning another. Most of you are familiar with simile, a figure in which a similarity between two objects is directly expressed. Similes compare two unlike things on the basis of one aspect they have in common. In simile, both the subject, which is to be figuratively represented, or tenor, and the thing to which it is likened, or vehicle, are clearly expressed and are joined by some overt indicator of the resemblance, such as like or as, or by words such as compare, liken, or resemble. Simile, used with skill, can create memorable, sensuous images for the reader. See what Michael Ondaatje accomplishes. The beautiful songs of faith enter the air like arrows, one minaret answering another, as if passing on a rumor of the two of them as they walk through the cold morning air. What extraordinarily original yet engaging images he has found. Songs of faith entering the air like arrows, and minarets passing on a rumor. This is gorgeous writing. Metaphor is a little more complicated than simile. As Mary Oliver puts it, the metaphor is an implicit rather than an explicit comparison. It does not use the words like or as in its construction. The two things compared often seem very different, and the linkage often surprises and delights as well as enlightens. Margaret Atwood begins this sentence with a simile and then completes it with a metaphor. Wild geese flying south, creaking like anguished hinges. Along the riverbank, the candles of the sumacs burn dull red. Note how she titillates our senses, using sound in the simile involving the geese, and then switching to sight in the metaphor of the sumacs. Reading about the senses stimulates our senses and delights us. The comparison of one thing to another can be continued and extended throughout a series of lines in a poem or sentences in a paragraph. This is called an extended metaphor. Louise Erdrich provides a nice example. Grandpa's mind had left us, gone wild and wary. When I walked with him, I could feel how strange it was. His thoughts swam between us, hidden under rocks, disappearing in the weeds, and I was fishing for them, dangling my own words like baits and lures. The metaphor here is Grandpa's mind or thoughts being likened to fish. It conveys a deeper sense of the writer's meaning through the comparison, which itself is also rich with imagery and with simile. Notice, too, that the metaphor here is established not with a noun, but with the verb swim, which in the context leads us to the implied noun fish. Sometimes extended metaphors start with a simile and slide into a metaphor. Toni Morrison grows such a figure. Shivering, Denver approached the house, regarding it, as she always did, as a person rather than a structure. A person that wept, sighed, trembled, and fell into fits. Her steps and her gaze were the cautious ones of a child approaching a nervous relative, someone dependent but proud. The comparative link of the house to a person is made clear in the simile. Then the comparison is extended in the metaphor, which tells the reader what kind of person the house is like. Imagery is another important poetic device which does not gain its primary effectiveness from sound or rhythm, but through the stimulation of the reader's senses. See how the technique works in a very famous descriptive scene from F. Scott Fitzgerald. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end, and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. While there is a musical quality to this piece of writing, by far and away its major impact comes from the incredible vision the reader gets, expressed both directly and also through metaphor and simile. Imagery is an important tool, but it often benefits from the aid of rhythm, repetition, simile, metaphor, assonance, consonants, and/or alliteration to achieve maximum effectiveness. While the use of imagery and figures of speech can result in the achievement of shockingly beautiful writing, it can also be misused or overused. In a review of Jhumpa Lahiri's The Lowland, an LA Times reviewer made some harsh comments that point out the risks involved in the use of imagery. If you are reading The Lowland for anthropological insight over all else, you might feel satiated. Even then, there are problems. Lahiri sometimes dips into cheaply microwaved otherness. Take, for example, autumn leaves rendered in lowland style. Once more, the trees lost their chlorophyll, replaced by the shades he had left behind. Vivid hues of cayenne and turmeric and ginger, pounded fresh every morning in the kitchen to season the foods his mother had prepared. Lines like these read like a parody of contemporary transnational literature at best. I will allow you to decide whether or not you agree with this reviewer. Returning now to devices that rely on repetition, rhythm, and other musical elements such as measure, we move to parallelism. Parallelism is the use of components in a sentence that are grammatically the same or similar in their construction, sound, meaning, or meter. Look at these lines by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. These kinds of sentences are sometimes called balanced sentences. A balanced sentence can be a sentence that has two or more clauses within it that balance each other, as in the Dickens lines above, which exhibit 10 balanced clauses, but it can also be one which has two or more balancing phrases. Martin Luther King Jr. frequently used balanced sentences in his writing. We shall have to repent in this generation, not so much for the evil deeds of the wicked people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. The balance here is in the phrases, the evil deeds of the wicked people and the appalling silence of the good people. Serial sentences are a form of balanced sentences that are also helpful vehicles to establish rhythm within your work. A serial sentence contains three or more syntactically parallel parts that are short enough that the reader or listener's ear hears them. The parts can be independent clauses, dependent clauses, free modifiers, or prepositional or other forms of phrases. However, the parts balanced always consist of the same part of speech or grammatical structure. The lines from Dickens, quoted earlier, utilized a series of independent clauses with parallel structure. An example of a serial sentence with a 5-part series of verb phrases comes to us from Reverend Solveig Nielsen Gooden. The prayer of the mystic dives headfirst into the realm of divine excess, plunges recklessly into an ocean of incredible abundance, runs wildly into a state of undeserved grace, charges madly into a field of inexplicable beauty, leaps over the boundaries of reason into a land of unreasonable and almost absurd delight. The effect of the 5-part series of verb phrases, going on and wildly on, lends rhythmical power to the idea of excessiveness that Reverend Nielsen Gooden is trying to convey. I would like to conclude this lecture with a careful examination of one of the most studied openings of all American novels. It is from Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. In the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. In the bed of the river there were pebbles and boulders, dry and white in the sun, and the water was clear and swiftly moving and blue in the channels. Troops went by the house and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees, too, were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year, and we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising and leaves stirred by the breeze falling, and the soldiers marching, and afterward the road bare and white except for the leaves. In 1998, in the New Yorker magazine, Joan Didion wrote a dazzling analysis and commentary on this paragraph, which she had just quoted. She said, "That paragraph, which was published in 1929, bears examination. 4 deceptively simple sentences, 126 words, the arrangement of which remains as mysterious and thrilling to me now as it did when I first read them at 12 or 13, and imagine that if I studied them closely enough and practiced hard enough, I might one day arrange 126 such words myself. Only one of the words has 3 syllables. 22 have 2. The other 103 have 1. 24 of the words are the, 15 are and. There are 4 commas. The liturgical cadence of the paragraph derives in part from the placement of the commas, their presence in the second and fourth sentences, their absence in the first and third, but also from the repetition of the and of and, creating a rhythm so pronounced that the omission of the before the word leaves in the fourth sentence, and we saw the troops marching along the road and the dust rising and leaves stirred by the breeze falling, cast exactly what it was meant to cast, a chill, a premonition, a foreshadowing of the story to come, the awareness that the author has already shifted his attention from late summer to a darker season. The power of the paragraph derives precisely from this kind of deliberate omission, from the tension of withheld information. In the late summer of what year? What river? What mountains? What troops? Now, from our studies, we recognize that the effect of repeating one word 24 times and another word 15 times, a technique called repetend, if you remember, is going to be musical. Each word is a sound, and the sounds being repeated create rhyme and rhythm. Didion's comments about cadence and the omission of the expected the before leaves are right on point. But let's go a little further and see if we can find other devices at work. First, note that this is a series of no fewer than 4 serial sentences, one following the other, the first 2 of which have 4 prepositional phrases, and the second 2 of which each have 3. There was a total of 14 prepositional phrases, 6 of which begin with in, and 3 of which begin with of, 2 of those being identical, of the trees. The cadence and rhythm derives not just from the presence or absence of commas, but also from the extreme repetition of a single grammatical structure. Since many of the prepositions are repeats, there is a tremendous amount of internal rhyme beyond just that in the words the and. Now let's take a look at Hemingway's use of poetic devices to create musicality, beginning with assonance. The most common vowel sound in the passage is the short I sound. As noted before, the word in appears 6 times. The sound is also used in lived, river, swiftly, moving, marching, rising, falling, and marching for a total of 14 short I sounds. Long E is the next most common assonance. It appears in year, clear, leaves, trees, leaves, year, leaves, breeze, and leaves for a total of 9. Long A appears 4 times, as does long I. Now let's look at alliteration and consonants. The TH sound appears 29 times, all in alliteration. Besides the repetition of the word the 24 times, we also have that, there, they, and that. The L sound is used in the way of alliteration 7 times. In addition, the sound appears in the middle or end of other words 10 times, making a total of 17 usages. The T sound appears 7 times in alliterated words, and it appears in consonants 8 more times, for a total of 15. The B sound appears 6 times in alliteration and 1 time in consonants. The number of repetitions of various sounds Hemingway put into just one paragraph is truly remarkable. And what of the imagery? It is all visual imagery, but it is tremendously powerful in its clarity. The sun, the dust, the troops, the trees, and the leaves. None of Hemingway's achievements here was accidental. As you're probably aware, he did commence his career writing poetry as well as prose. I'm concluding my lecture with this opening to A Farewell to Arms, both because it is so well known and because I would argue it is the use of poetic devices which render it so. When used in prose, these devices strengthen descriptions, characterizations, and the overall power of the work. I hope that you will continue reading and studying poetry as you write, not just for the pleasure and wisdom it will afford, but to help you create more lyrical prose, especially in those sections of your book which are particularly important as, among others, the beginning and the end. Thank you.